Good morning, and wherever you are joining us from today, welcome to this program, Baptists and the Nations, Religious Freedom Challenges Around the Globe. My name is Brent Leatherwood, Chief of Staff here at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. One need only look at the latest headlines to see that challenges really cannot possibly carry the weight of the conflicts that we see across the international landscape right now. From Central Asia to the Caribbean, human dignity is being assaulted and religious freedom is being undermined. And yet, even as that instability and in some cases violence reigns, Christians are humbly serving our Lord by going into all the world and proclaiming the gospel to the whole creation. Oh, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring forth the good news. To talk about all of this, I am joined today by several experts who will help us briefly explore the globe. Joining first is Todd Lafferty. Todd is the Executive Vice President of the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist Convention. He first served as a journeyman in Scotland from 1983 to 1985. He and his wife Susan were appointed in 1991 as career IMB missionaries to a large South Asian city, where he was a pastor of an international church and later a strategy coordinator. Next is Dr. Paul D. Miller. He's a professor of the practice of international affairs at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. Previously, Paul served as director for Afghanistan and Pakistan on the National Security Council staff, and he worked as an intelligence analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency, and he served as a military intelligence officer in the United States Army. And finally is my colleague Chelsea Sobolik. She serves as the acting director of public policy with the ERLC in our Washington, D.C. office. And in that role, Chelsea manages all of our legislative, legal, and international work. Previously, she worked on Capitol Hill for a member of Congress, overseeing domestic and international religious freedom issues. So thank you all for joining me here and our audience today. All right, so Paul, we're going to begin with Afghanistan, and it's only appropriate that we would begin there. As an example of how fast things can develop on the global stage, a month ago, as we were thinking through this event, we thought of beginning with a focus on the Olympics or even China, and that would make the most sense. However, events have unfolded so fast in Afghanistan, we absolutely must start in that part of the world. Just this morning, news has come across that there was a large explosion just outside of the gates of Hamid Karzai International Airport, where so many souls are anxiously awaiting an opportunity to flee the country right now. So as a foreign policy expert and as someone who served in Afghanistan, can you just briefly explain for our audience how all of this happened so quickly?
Thank you, Brent, for the question, and thanks for the invitation to speak on this webinar. It does feel as if this happened very quickly in the last 2 weeks. It's important to recognize the Taliban had been making incremental gains for several years, in fact. And after the Trump administration signed a peace deal with the Taliban last February, and after President Biden announced his intent to implement that decision, that peace deal, in April of this year, that's when the Taliban understood that they were going to win the war. And they put in place their final campaign that really launched in the end of May, where they began to take several provincial capitals peacefully, largely without fighting, because the Afghan army suffered a crippling collapse of morale when they understood that the international community would no longer be there to support them or provide air cover. It came to international attention just these last 2 weeks as the Taliban finished their conquest and took Kabul, and we've seen the disaster at the Kabul airport. But it has been a long time in coming. This has been one of the greatest setbacks for international religious freedom that we've lived through. It's very dramatic. We all know what the Taliban are and that they will not respect religious freedom or any human rights. It's a very sad situation. And right now, I think the attention is rightly focused on the evacuation operations, trying to get people out as much as we can.
And, just to clarify something, I think a number of folks, they had been thinking about Afghanistan and that we had this gigantic force there, gigantic military force. Is that accurate?
No, the United States military force was down to about 2,500 soldiers at the beginning of this year. It's a very small military footprint and had been small below 15,000 for the last 10 years or so. We had a large force of over 100,000 troops in the first year or two of President Obama's tenure. We're talking 2009 and 10. But President Obama began to draw down that presence as early as 2010, and we just have not had large numbers of troops. They've not been engaged in ground combat in large numbers. U.S. service members were largely not in harm's way. We were in a supporting posture while the Afghans were out front fighting the Taliban for the past 10 years.
Todd, let me turn to you next. As someone who closely pays attention to global events, I'm sure you've had a number of conversations about the situation there. So let's zoom out from Afghanistan specifically and talk more broadly. First, when these sorts of crises hit, give us a sense of what happens there at IMB and what sorts of information are you all looking for, and what's the most immediate concerns for you and your team?
Yeah, thank you, Brent, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this day today and speaking about these issues. Of course, we would want to get in touch with our personnel as soon as possible to find out the situation on the ground. What is their risk level? Are they safe? Are they secure in their location? We would want to know what's happening in the city around them. Are there armed gangs that are taking parts of the city? Are the security forces in place to keep the peace across the city? Our crisis action team would swing into action. We would be calling for prayer for the situation in that particular place. We'd want to know, can you make it to an airport? Can you make it to a seaport? Can you cross a border if that would become necessary for our personnel there? For us on the ground, when we're in those situations, we lived through some of this fighting on the ground in a particular city where we lived. Sometimes our local friends were the best source of intel, and they would let us know what's going on around the city, and they had avenues of communication that we didn't have. And they would tell us, hey, you need to stay home today, you need to lay low, you need to hunker down. So we're also part of the consulate warden system. I was the warden there living in that city, and we would get circulars from the U.S. consulate in that city, and we would get the latest update on security situation. We would pass that on to other Americans living in the city so that we would all stay in touch with what's happening and understand the seriousness of the issue and whether or not it was time to make a move to exit or if we could continue to stay in that city at that time.
Right. This morning, I was reading that priority is being given to American citizens as well as green card holders to leave Afghanistan. Is the IMB in contact with the American government to just help facilitate some of these in case there are Christians on the ground there who need help?
We have contact with people on the ground. We, of course, we know believers there. And right. So we have been in communication, thankful for the help that we've been able to get along the way. These are sensitive issues, of course. And so the Taliban have stated that they're not going to allow religious freedom to continue in their country. Once everyone is out of sight, then we'll see who the Taliban really are. We lived in country next door, and we saw them rise up in the 90s. We've seen them in action and what they can do to believers and tracking them down. There are posters of believers now across the city of Kabul, and we know that they're going after them. Our young daughters have already been ripped away from families and given to Taliban fighters. So we're doing everything we can, Brent, to try to help facilitate getting people out of the country. We hope and pray that our government on the ground will help facilitate that as well. And so these are difficult issues we're facing right now.
Absolutely. Chelsea, continuing to look at Afghanistan, can you help our audience explain how the ERLC reacted to all of this? And with the Taliban retaking control, as Todd was talking about there, what concerns do we have for religious liberty and for those made vulnerable by this new reality?
Absolutely. And I want to acknowledge that even as we're having this event, things are changing moment by moment. I know there's been several suicide bombings over there. So I just want to acknowledge that things are changing very rapidly. However, last week, the ERLC, in partnership with several other evangelical organizations, along with the Evangelical Immigration Table, we all sent President Biden a letter urging him to honor his commitment to stand with our Afghan allies who put themselves and their families at risk, serving alongside and with the US government. The letter also specifically asks for an urgent increase of priority to processing for Afghan refugees. There's been a lot of talk of the social immigration visa categories. There also needs to be a lot of talk and priority given to those who don't fit under that umbrella. So Christians, religious minorities, women and children who can flee the Taliban's rule. So we have sent that letter, and we're very actively advocating with the administration for that. We've also published multiple pieces on our website, helping people think through these issues. You know, we have a prayer guide, we have some explainers on what priority to refugee status is and why it should be applied to this situation. And then our colleague Julie wrote an article on ways parents can help talk to their children about what's going on in Afghanistan. To your question about concerns, obviously, as Todd laid out, we have deep concerns for Christians and other religious minorities in Afghanistan. According to Open Doors USA, they produce a fantastic report every year. Afghanistan is the second most dangerous country in the world, only second to North Korea, to be a Christian. And those numbers came in even while the US troops were there. So I would just, point out that will continue to, that persecution against Christians and religious minorities will continue to increase as the US draws back. And then additionally, something else that's deeply, deeply concerning is the Taliban's treatment of women and girls. Before the US entered in 2001, women in Afghanistan were barred from attending school, from working outside the home, and from even leaving the house without a male chaperone. When the US liberated Afghanistan in 2001, women and girls began to enjoy much more newfound freedom. And there's a generation of young women who have only grown up with freedom. And the Taliban, while it has given lip service to, honoring women, we've already begun to see that women have been sent home from the workplace. I saw something today that was instructing women that they could not leave the house again without a male chaperone. So we are continuing to advocate for those women and girls as well.
And needless to say, it is a deteriorating situation there as far as some of these very essential rights that we've come to know as Americans. This next question is for all of you together. Paul, we'll begin with you. How should Christians process international emergencies? There's a ton of information that is just coming at us continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. How can we process that? And what responsibilities do we have as believers in moments like this? So Paul, we'll begin with you.
Well, I think it is appropriate for us to seek ways to help through organizations like the IMB or the NAMB, depending upon where it is, or through other charitable organizations, or to help with refugee resettlement. There's a lot of organizations doing that right now. I think it's appropriate to focus on the immediate need. But I also want to say that I think that we have a responsibility as citizens to try to pay attention beyond the day's headlines and be aware of the world as it is. There are a lot of other emerging and important issues that may not feel like today's crisis, and yet they are deeply concerning, deeply worrying. I think we're going to talk about China in just a bit. The rise of China is one of the central facts of the world and has been for 2.5, 3 decades. And that isn't today's crisis, but it is one of the most important political facts for us to be aware of. And it has serious implications for international religious freedom, human rights, for the democracy in the world. So yes, we should pay attention to the crisis, but we should go beyond it as well.
Todd?
Yeah, we're trying to ramp up operations around Afghanistan to be able to minister to folks that are leaving, to help with the refugee crisis. When we lived next door to Afghanistan, there were approximately 2 million living in the city and along the border where we lived. And so there's great opportunity for the church to rise up and minister and serve during these crisis opportunities. These give us access to people that perhaps we didn't have before as the church. And so we need to be praying for those opportunities, those doors to open of ministry, and giving us opportunities to share the gospel with people that are really without hope and need a good word of hope, and to help them practically as well. And so just this past weekend, we've seen ramping up of our SBC constituency giving tremendously to the need of the Afghan people. And we'll be helping, working together through Send Relief and NAM to help provide opportunities for refugees to get resettled, practical opportunities. We have a number of different locations around the country that we're already working with different groups to help that process, partnering with World Relief and the need to help resettle these folks. And this gives us an opportunity as a church to reach the nations that have come among us. Oftentimes we're trying to get into different places to share the good news of Christ, and then the opportunity comes where they come to us. And so this gives us a great opportunity to be salt and light. And so we need to pray that Christians here would receive them with open arms and see this as God's appointed time, maybe a Kairos moment in history, where we actually have an opportunity to minister to people that we would never be able to touch because they're behind closed borders and hard to reach places. And so the Lord is doing something here as well in moving people, and we have a great opportunity to join in what he's doing around the world as these things happen.
Yeah, he always is. And praise God for that uptick in designated giving for this crisis that you mentioned. Yeah. Chelsea, go ahead and answer this as well. How should Christians process these sorts of international crises?
Absolutely. Well, I first would echo Todd's encouragement to each one of us to pray. I think it can be tempting when we see these images and videos to feel utterly helpless, but we're not. As Christians, we can get on our knees and pray on behalf of vulnerable people in Afghanistan and around the world who are facing persecution. And we can also pray that those persecutors, the Taliban, that people would share the gospel with them, and that they would come to know Christ as their savior as well. We see that modeled in scripture with Saul becoming Paul. And I think it's also important for us to remember that each one of these images and videos and each one of these stories we read, they're human beings made in the image of God. They bear God's image and they have innate dignity and worth. And again, that temptation is there for us to maybe be frightened of people who don't dress like us or don't come from the same background or culture. But they're image bearers of God, and we have, like Todd said, we have the opportunity to pray for them. And then as they're coming into our nation, we have the opportunity to be the hands and feet of Christ and to love and to serve them.
That's great, Chelsea. And I want to stick with you actually to begin this next section. I want to turn to East Asia and China, and to be specific, the actions of the Chinese Communist government in China. At the ERLC, this has been a top concern for us with our international work, especially given the crisis facing the Uyghurs. To help our audience understand more, please tell us, who are the Uyghurs? Why should Christians in America be concerned about them? And what has been done to bring attention to the situation there?
Absolutely. So the Uyghur people are a predominantly Turk-speaking ethnic group who live in the Xinjiang province of China. It's China's westernmost territory. Uyghurs have lived there for centuries. I'll be as brief as I can in this explanation, but that territory in China is extremely important because China's Belt and Road Initiative, their modern day Silk Road initiative, flows directly through that province. So that province is extremely important to them. And another important thing to understand about China and the Uyghurs and what's happening is China places a high price on ethnically Han Chinese people, and the Uyghurs don't fit there. So you have the ethnic component and then the economic component as well. But since 2017, the Chinese Communist Party has essentially waged a systematic campaign of oppression against the Uyghur Muslims. They've detained an estimated 1 to 3 Uyghur people in re-education camps, which are essentially modern day concentration camps where they are facing political indoctrination, physical torture. Women have been raped and subjected to malnutrition. There's also been reports of forced organ harvesting. And then once Uyghurs have graduated from those camps, they are then sent to forced labor camps, where they are forced to labor for long hours with little to no pay, and they cannot escape that. Uyghur women have also been subjected to forced sterilizations and forced abortions. So there's just a number of ways the Chinese Communist Party is committing mass atrocities, and what the Trump administration in December or January labeled a genocide. We, at the end of last year, advocated very strongly for that determination to be made. And then the Biden administration has continued that determination, which is extremely important for the US, but also to model leadership to the world about how we should respond to China's human rights and religious freedom abuses. Why it matters to us. Christians should be on the forefront of advocating for the dignity and human rights of all people, and we cannot remain silent in the face of injustices. ERLC has been active on this front for a number of years. You know, we've written op-eds in the Wall Street Journal. We have hosted an event last summer. We hosted an event with former IRF Ambassador Sam Brownback, USCIRF Commissioner Nuri Turkle, and Uyghur activists. And then this spring, the Southern Baptist Convention was the first Protestant denomination to pass a resolution labeling the Uyghur persecution as genocide. So we have also advocated for multiple pieces of legislation, including the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which recently passed the Senate, and we are urging the House to pass that as well. So there's a lot more I could say on this topic. I would refer folks to our website where we have some excellent resources, and then if folks are interested, they can go back and watch our webinar last summer.
So Todd, Chelsea mentioned that unanimous resolution that was passed by messengers at this most recent SBC annual meeting. Are moves like that helpful for Christians in East Asia? Are they helpful for our Great Commission work overall? And are there other ways that you would recommend our churches consider to be helpful in East Asia?
Yeah, well, I'll say it didn't hurt us at all because we don't have anyone living in the country right now. If we did, that would be another story. It might be rather difficult for us to continue that work. But make no mistake, as Chelsea has eloquently laid out, this is a genocide. This is evil. Ripping these men out of their homes, placing Han men in the homes of those left behind. What they're doing there is just appalling. And we really shouldn't be surprised when President Xi came out with Document 9 in about 2012. They outlined their strategy to get rid of any outside influence. They don't specifically name Christian influence, but any religious influence, and obviously the Christian influence is one of those that they're trying to stamp out across China, as they've destroyed church buildings, but they won't destroy the church because Jesus said he's going to build his church. And so we know that will continue no matter what they do on the outside. But the atrocities have continued. They're retranslating the scriptures. Perhaps you've heard that process is taking place. They're changing the story, for example, of the woman caught in adultery, where Jesus tells her, "You're a sinner, I'm a sinner," and he stones her, and he says, "No one is above the law." And so what they're in effect saying is that the communist government is the greatest law in the land, and you have no say in that. And so that's the process that they're going through now in retranslating the scriptures. A man selling Bibles, the real Bible, was sentenced to 7 years in prison recently in China. So we know that the Chinese government knows the SBC. We were there a long time ago. There's much history of our work there. They know who Lottie Moon is. They're concerned about anyone who actually gives money to Lottie Moon. We've heard that through various contacts, and so I think prayer is one of the biggest ways that we can continue to impact the Chinese government, the Chinese world at this time. But I'll tell you what, it's exciting what God is doing across that land. That work is not stopping. The Chinese believers want to see their group grow by tenfold in the middle of this persecution. They know it's coming. Many of them are old enough to have lived through it in the past, and they know what God can do in the midst of persecution, and they're trusting him for what can happen even in the midst of persecution. But we're working on strategies outside and around, and so we continue to stay in touch with partners there, and we'll continue to do that in the future.
That's good. Paul, coming to you, earlier in your professional career, you prepared a daily intelligence assessment for the President of the United States. A few aspects of that, actually, a lot of it interests me, but just a few aspects. What goes into that presentation in an ongoing event such as the Uyghur genocide? Is it routinely updated as a part of that assessment? Why or why not? And when a large public step is made by the church, for example, like the SBC did, and calling it a genocide, is that at all helpful in making the case that some international events be paid attention to by the president or our national leaders?
So the president's daily brief and other intelligence products are partly a response to the president's priorities. So sometimes the president or the national security advisor will simply commission a piece on a topic of their interest. It's also made up of the intelligence community's own assessment of what's most important in the world. So it's kind of bottom up and top down. In that context, yes, it can be partly responsive to public pressure. If the public is highly engaged in an international event, such as the Uyghur genocide or what's going on in Afghanistan, I think you are more likely to see senior policymakers ask the intelligence community about it, and you get policymaker dialogue on those things going. So that I think what, again, in answer to your question, the answer is yes, it can be helpful. There's a part of your question there I think I may have missed out, because you asked like 3 separate things right there. Was there something I missed?
No, I did. I mean, is an ongoing event such as the Uyghur genocide, is it routinely updated as a part of the assessment?
It depends upon the level of presidential engagement. When President Trump designated a genocide, I would expect probably yes. It's a pretty big step to officially label something a genocide. Once you do that, I expect the intelligence community probably put it pretty high on their priority list to give regular short updates on what's happening. Is the Chinese government responsive to international pressure or not? So I think the answer is yes. Of course, I can't, I don't have no inside information here, but I think it is the kind of thing that would get regular updates. I know that presidents have a habit of always having daily updates on any military action overseas. That's kind of priority number 1. But beyond that, it'll be other high priority international issues. Okay. If I could make a kind of a separate comment on this issue Please. Of China and religious freedom, I think it's important to keep in mind that the way a government treats its people reveals its character. And that character will eventually also be revealed in how it treats other nations. And so when the communist government, when the CCP treats the Uyghurs or the Falun Gong or the Tibetans or the Hong Kongers as disposable without any rights or dignity, you can bet that sooner or later, the Chinese government will also take that same attitude and apply it to its neighboring countries, to Korea, to Japan, to the Philippines, as it's currently doing in the South China Sea. So what I'm saying is there's a strong correlation between human rights at home and religious freedom at home and international aggression. And I'm deeply worried by the character of the regime we see in China, and what that character says will be their posture looking outward on the international stage. As I said, the rise of China is one of the central facts of the 21st century. They're very powerful, they're strong, they're getting richer every day. Their character, they've shown us what their character is. They're deeply aggressive, they do not respect human rights or human dignity. And I think we know where that leads on the international stage.
While we're in that theater, let's continue talking along those lines. As America has seemingly stepped back from some of our global commitments and alliances over the last decade, I think it's important to focus a little bit here more. Todd, just broadly, is there a point when a security situation in a given region gets so concerning that Christians who are overseas, American Christians who are overseas, should return home? Like, what is it that you at the IMB are looking for?
Yeah, that's a great question, Brandon. I'll just share my personal experience, having lived through a pretty difficult situation in the city where we were living, where there was virtual anarchy happening. One large part of the population was fighting the government. And so, of course, we always want to be in touch with those that are in our home office, letting them know what the situation is. We would begin to give ghosts rather dicey in the city. So we begin to ask questions, what is your security situation? Is it worth staying at this time? Are you bringing more danger to your local friends than should be happening? And if you stay, will they also receive the wrath of the local whoever's in charge? And so we want to make sure both spouses feel comfortable staying at the same time. So we have both of them giving a go stay report in the midst of what's happening. As outside leaders, we want to make sure that there's not a frog in the kettle approach happening, where you stay there long enough, you lay out tripwires, and so if this, then this. So if this happens, we're going to do this. We're going to hunker down. If this happens, then we're going to maybe move to another part of the country for a time to see if things will settle down. And so then you have hard targets. If a hard target is hit, then you're going to do this. If a soft target is hit, then you're going to do this. And so we're in touch with our folks on the ground to make sure that they can continue to do their work in the midst of a chaotic and dangerous and risky situation to them. Sometimes you have to punt and come back for another day. And so, for example, when President Clinton sent the missiles into Afghanistan in 1998, there was a bounty on the heads of every American man, woman, or child of $10,000 by a guy named Osama bin Laden, who wasn't exactly a household name back then. And our outside leadership said you have 48 hours to get out of the country. So at that point, the choice is taken away and you follow your leadership. We punted, we came back 5 weeks later to continue the work that God had called us to. And so there's give and take. We see Paul leaving some places. We see Paul taking a pretty good beating in some places. And so it takes a lot of prayer, a lot of wisdom, a lot of counsel of, the multitude of counsel is wise. And so we take counsel from those inside the country who are seeing it firsthand, but also those that are outside the country that can also provide wisdom. They've perhaps lived through some of these situations in the past, and they can give guidance when our people are in the midst of those situations. So we don't go past the tripwires too many times. We don't let the frog in the kettle get boiled.
Right.
So,
your use of the military tool tripwires there is appropriate, because we're going to go to a military expert next in Paul. So Paul, most people, again, focusing on the kind of Pacific theater, most people likely don't realize what kinds of dramatic changes have occurred recently in Hong Kong. Can you provide a brief summary of what has happened there? And as you survey that situation, what lessons should be drawn from it for the wider East Asia region?
So Hong Kong had been governed by the United Kingdom for 300 years until 1999, I think, maybe 97. Then Britain handed over sovereignty to China under an agreement that the Chinese government would respect Hong Kong's autonomy. And so for the last 20 years, Hong Kong has actually been able to govern itself under democratic norms and respect human rights, even though it's part of China. In the last year, China ended that arrangement. It broke its promise, reneged on the deal, and has fully incorporated Hong Kong into normal Chinese governance, which means there's essentially no historic freedoms that Hong Kongers had enjoyed for the past 3 centuries. It's a tragic loss for freedom, for human rights, for religious freedom, and again, it kind of shows the character of the Chinese regime in breaking their promise and then extending their authoritarianism over another part of their territory. You asked about lessons. I think the lesson is to keep an eye on the Chinese Communist Party because again, they're showing their character. They're showing their intent and desire to expand their influence. Hong Kong, by the way, is one of the centers of economic activity in East Asia. It's a really rich city, and so for it to come fully under China's sway is terrible. I just can't stress enough. Again, the lesson I think is watch out. These are slowly moving developments that have been underway for 2 or 3 decades, and it's not getting the headlines the way Kabul has been this week. But I think it's essentially should be the top of the agenda because I'm worried about what kind of world is being built with this kind of regime and the kind of power they have.
Chelsea, given the global shifts and changes that we've seen in this region and around the globe, how has our work with the State Department and other entities on inter-country adoption been affected?
Absolutely. So I will start with China and then go broader. So in March 2020, when COVID-19 had just become prevalent in the United States, China, along with many other countries, suspended foreign adoption for folks to be able to travel and pick up their children. The difference with China compared to many other countries is they have yet to reopen for families to go pick up their children and finalize those adoptions. And it's affected about 400 American families. One thing to note on this point, it's a very delicate dance because about a decade ago, Russia completely closed down their inter-country adoption program, and we don't want that to happen. So it's a very delicate advocacy approach. I know the State Department has been involved, the Congressional Coalition on Adoption has been involved, and those members of Congress have been advocating for families to safely travel and be able to pick up their children. Additionally, inter-country adoption is at an all-time low. It peaked in the mid-2000s, and there were about 23,000 inter-country adoptions at the peak. And then the last reported numbers were about 1,600 kiddos all over the world being adopted into the United States. And the ERLC, well, let me say one more comment, and then I'll talk about our engagement. Some of the reasons for the decline are very positive. Some countries who historically did not view adoption in the way we think it ought to be viewed, in some more of the honor shame cultures or in some African cultures, they have become a lot more open to domestic adoption and foster care, which is fantastic. That means that kids can stay in their local communities and in their countries. So some of the reasons for the decline are very positive. There's some reasons that are negative, but I will say one of the ways we approach inter-country adoption at the ERLC is maintaining that it ought to be a viable option. Of course, there's many ways we can care for kiddos internationally, but inter-country adoption must remain a viable option because for some kiddos in certain countries, their only chance at a safe, loving, and permanent family is to be adopted. internationally. And I read some statistics recently that said more than 1 million children worldwide lost at least one parent to COVID-19. So the amount of children without at least one parent, maybe 2 caregivers, is increasing, which means the fact that intercountry adoption must remain a viable option will continue to increase as well.
Okay, so the final region that we're going to be able to look at today very briefly is Eastern Europe. And so, Paul, let me start with you. Lately in evangelical circles, it appears to be somewhat fashionable to point to Hungary as an example of a free society dedicated to moral conservatism. Is Hungary actually setting a helpful bar that American Christians should learn from? Why or why not?
That's a great question, and I'm really happy to have a chance to address this, because Hungary, like many other governments, has seen an upsurge in populist and nationalist sentiments in just the last couple of years. And oftentimes that comes accompanied by the language or rhetoric of Christianity. Hungary has declared itself to be a Christian nation in its constitution. Poland has come close to doing something similar. Brazil, with Catholicism, something similar. And what I want to emphasize is that as Christians, we should not immediately buy in, but take that at face value. Quite often in history, governments will use the language and the rhetoric of religion, Christianity or other religions, to borrow their moral legitimacy. And then they use that moral legitimacy to do things that governments have always done. And so they can sometimes borrow the language of Christianity and then go oppress people. In the case of Hungary right now, while it calls itself a Christian country and has tried to cultivate a culture of Christian norms, it is also, the prime minister has subverted the independence of the judiciary and the media, and has not allowed in refugees, and has said some pretty nasty things about them, and is walking the fine line of treating ethnic and religious minorities as second-class citizens. I don't think any of that is Christian. I don't think it's Christian to subvert the norms of democracy, human rights, and human dignity. So we, as Christians, we need to take a pretty close look whenever a government calls itself Christian. We need to look at their behavior before we say, oh, that's a good model we should follow. You're right, many American conservatives, Tucker Carlson was over there recently, Rod Dreher was there recently. And I think, again, we need to be more discriminating and not necessarily take the claims at face value, look at the behavior. And in my case, I think I see some troubling behavior that isn't reflective of true Christian justice.
Todd, for this region in particular, a recent Pew Research survey showed it to be one of the least religious parts of the world. Some of that, no doubt, is due to the lingering result of Soviet control from decades ago, but also because Europe as a region as a whole is drifting from religious affiliation. That said, there are Christians there doing some incredible work on the ground. Are there any stories you can share with our audience of how the gospel is being shared and making a difference in the lives of people in that part of the globe?
Yeah, Brent, one of our leaders went over to Moldova recently, and Moldova has a Christian background, obviously, a fairly good Baptist presence in the country, but had become very nominal through the years with the Soviet influence and just beating down of Christianity across that part of the world. And so our leader didn't know what to expect. He didn't know if there'd be much openness there among the leaders. And so they called together, as many would come, for Great Commission training. Okay, what is the vision of the Great Commission and how can we live out the Great Commission in our day? And so 40 pastors came. And at the end of the training, the leader, the Moldovan leaders stood up and said, you need to take this back to every church in our entire country needs this training. They spent the last 3 days of the training pairing up with Moldovan pastors and fanning out the villages, much like Jesus sent his 72 out 2 by 2 to the villages. And so during the last 3 days of that training, they saw 32 Moldovans accept Christ as Savior as a result of going out and doing evangelism in the villages, and 20 others who said, we're interested, we want to hear more. And so we're finding this across Europe, where we will go out and share the good news of Christ. It's actually kind of a radical concept now to believe that there is a God, that there is one God, that Jesus died for our sins on the cross. This is really news to many people in this part of the world, and it's sounding like very good news to many who are hearing the gospel really for the very first time. And so we're encouraged by what's happening. There's so far, of course, so far to go across Europe, but
Sure.
Eastern Europe seems to be a bright light that is beginning to shine, and we're praying that that would continue.
And I mean, we should stop there. It never ceases to amaze me that those kinds of wins are funded by the cooperative efforts of
That's right.
Baptists here at home, and
That's
that
right.
is just the cooperative program. Just always want to tout how
Amen.
important that is to our
We-
missionary work overseas. Okay, so
Indeed.
finally, finally, we've got 1 minute each on this one. We've covered a lot of ground in this conversation, and so much more could be said. We could spend all day actually discussing this in depth, but this final question is open to each of you, and I want to end where I initiated today's conversation. If you would be so kind, just take 1 minute to tell our audience how the Great Commission affects your work on a day-to-day basis. How does it motivate you? Chelsea, we'll begin with you.
Absolutely. So in each one of our roles, myself in Washington, D.C., and each one of our roles, the panelists and our audience, our work tells the world about what God is like. Our work to advance human flourishing, to promote good governance, to work to end injustices, and to share the gospel. We are telling the watching world who does not know God what he is like. So I think the Great Commission compels me to be to carry the good news in a truthful and beautiful way, to work to not only equip Southern Baptists and Christians to be involved in this work, but to do so in a way that people are curious about why we do this work, that people ask questions about the God we serve and why we care to get involved in events that are happening across the world.
Paul?
Well, I think of my vocation as a teacher. My job is to pursue truth and also to speak the truth in love. And if through that I can help educate people, my students, or a broader audience, about what justice looks like in the world and where injustice is happening, that I hope can give people an image of the author of justice, of our Heavenly Father, and also motivate us as Christians to work to end injustice where it is. And that, I think, is the way I can contribute to the Great Commission.
And Todd, a question on the Great Commission. It's only appropriate that we would end with a leader of our IMB.
Yeah, well, as one of our global leaders, we gathered as a team a couple of years ago, and we changed our mission statement to say we serve Southern Baptists in carrying out the Great Commission to make disciples of all nations. And so you mentioned the cooperative program. We can't carry out the Great Commission without the cooperation of all of our churches working together to make that happen. And as we think about nations, Brent, there are 11,000 people groups across the world. 7,000 of those are unreached people groups, less than 2% Christian. Of those 7,000, there are over 3,000 that are totally unengaged and unreached with the gospel. That means no one, as far as we know, is trying to reach them. That is our vision at the IMB, is to reach every last people group. And that vision is a Revelation 7:9 vision, to see a vast multitude from every nation, tribe, people, and language, knowing and worshiping the Lord Jesus Christ. And the nations are still waiting after 2,000 years to hear this good news for the very first time. And that's what we want to be about, is bringing that good news to the ends of the earth.
Oh, that's amazing. That's a great way to end it. So, y'all, this was a truly engaging and informative conversation today. To learn more about Paul Miller, visit his website at pauldavidmiller.com. He is a fantastic follow on social media. For more about Todd Lafferty and his work, go to the International Mission Board's website, our sister entity, imb.org. And to read more from Chelsea, myself, and our whole team here at the ERLC, please visit our website, erlc.com. Thank you again, and good day from Nashville, Tennessee.